How evil do you have to be considered too much in Nazi Germany? This is a question posed for the 36th Waffen Grenadier Division of the SS, better known by its other names, the Black Hunters, or simply the Dirlewanger Brigade. This was a violent band of thieves, rapists, and murderers who were already steeped in evil long before they put on an SS uniform. This brigade was so vile that even other members of the SS loathed them. Today, on Beneath the Surface, we will explore how this group of men earned themselves the title of the worst brigade in the SS. By the spring of 1940, Germany held dominion over Europe, with vast territories under its occupation. It desperately needed men to maintain order and suppress the lingering resistance groups in captured land. Since the most elite soldiers had already been sent to the front, the Reich looked elsewhere to fill the ranks of its occupation forces. Hitler had the perfect candidates in mind. Poachers were criminals, and thus would not normally be called up for military service, but they were physically fit and skilled with firearms. Hitler and Himmler held a romanticized vision of poachers, seeing them as a kind of rugged, untamed Aryan warrior, unbroken by society and capable of mastering the wilds. If the Nazis needed to hunt down rebels and partisans in the forests of occupied Europe, there were no better candidates. The order was given in March 1940. By June, a selection of 80 convicted poachers was assembled in Oranienburg to begin training. For this group, soon to be nicknamed the Black Hunters, its members ranged from common men on the wrong side of the law to more brutal criminals who just happened to be caught hunting on the wrong land. However, the character of this group would ultimately be defined by its leader, a singularly repulsive and evil man named Oskar Paul Dirlewanger. Even before joining the SS, Dirlewanger was a disgusting human being. He was a drunkard, a sadist, and had a passion for gambling and prostitutes. He had gained combat experience in the First World War, but never left the violence behind at the front. After 1918, he joined the far-right Freikorps militia, where he was involved in the violent suppression of workers' strikes and the targeted harassment of minorities. Despite his propensity for violence, he was not a mindless thug. He held a doctorate in political science and ran a factory for several years. Dirlewanger was an early member of the Nazi Party, joining in its early days in Munich in 1923 and working his way up the ranks over the next decade. His career seemingly came to an end in 1934 when he was arrested and convicted for the sexual abuse of a child. His rank and doctorate were stripped from him, but his connections within the Nazi Party saved him from rotting in prison. His friend Gottlob Berger, a senior SS official and an associate of Himmler, managed to get his sentence reduced, and he was released in 19. Dirlewanger was given a chance to join the Nazi Condor Legion, sent to Spain to support General Franco. There, his combat service, rife with accusations of brutality, earned him exoneration for his past crimes and the restoration of his old rank and honors. On Berger's recommendation, Himmler chose Dirlewanger to lead the new poacher unit. They hoped his own criminal past and record of brutality would bring these new men into line. Dirlewanger would indeed make these men follow his lead, but he would take them down an unspeakably evil path. After a few weeks of training, the new brigade was assigned to the Lublin district of Poland to serve as security in the occupied zone. In theory, their mission was to root out partisan activity, but records show no evidence that they ever encountered any such activity during their months there, nor did the unit suffer any casualties that would indicate such an encounter. In practice, the brigade's main task was the control, surveillance, and policing of the civilian population. They enforced curfews, seized suspects, and hauled Poles off to labor camps or to their execution. Dirlewanger's unit carried out their duties with a characteristic pattern of excessive brutality. Prisoners were beaten, and girls were raped. They unleashed patrol dogs on civilian crowds, leading to several deaths. In one instance, Dirlewanger injected prisoners with strychnine, merely to observe the effects. Dirlewanger and his men lived like bandit kings, with no accountability. They could loot and seize whatever they want. The labor camps never complained about receiving a few new alleged partisan prisoners, and everything they left behind was ripe for the taking. They were known for burning buildings after looting them, most likely to hide the bodies they left in their wake. At the time, the group numbered only a few dozen, but in their months in Poland, they amassed hundreds, if not thousands, of victims. However, with no partisan outbreaks and no casualties of their own, their time in Poland was deemed a success. In January 1942, the unit was reassigned to Belarus. If Poland was the prelude, then Belarus was the main event. Belarus, having been captured during Operation Barbarossa in the summer of 1941, was still a hotbed of Soviet resistance. The Dirlewanger Brigade arrived in February and quickly joined the harsh anti-partisan operations. For many brigade members, this was their first taste of combat. Dirlewanger personally led his men into battle, relishing in the slaughter. Most of the fighting occurred during large-scale sweep operations, and the brigade participated in at least 55 of them during their time in Belarus. Coordinating with other units, they would designate entire rural areas to be cleansed. In these designated death zones, it was open season. Any target was legitimate, any individual a potential partisan, and every building in enemy base to be burned. The orders handed down were simple. The entire population of the region, men, women, and children, dead or alive, is to be expelled. In May 1942, the brigade suffered its first combat casualties against enemy partisans. In response, they burned the nearby village to the ground. In another 3-week operation, the group reported 1,400 kills, a rate of about 3 people every hour. The brigade also cleared urban ghettos, such as one they burned down in late 1941, killing hundreds of civilians. Reports on the unit's performance flowed back to Berlin, describing them as better suited than any other troop for anti-partisan combat in difficult terrain. The Poacher Brigade was exceeding expectations. By early 1943, the brigade's role had expanded to evacuating civilians, chiefly Jews, to concentration camps as part of the Holocaust. In May 1943, the brigade took part in the single largest sweep operation in Belarus, Operation Kotbus, clearing the region north of Minsk. This several-week operation claimed over 20,000 lives in less than a month. The Dirlewanger Brigade was responsible for a huge share of that body count. Dirlewanger boasted that his men had killed some 15,000 people since operations began. He received special praise from Himmler himself for his strategy to clear minefields. What was that strategy? Gathering a bunch of civilians and forcing them to run ahead of his men, using their flesh and blood to detonate the mine. Scholars examining the brigade's reports have found a chilling discrepancy. For every one weapon they reported capturing, suggesting the victim was a partisan, they reported 8 to 10 people killed. The group was clearly reporting civilians as partisans to inflate their performance numbers. Perhaps fewer than 10% of their victims could be credibly considered rebels. The rest were civilians, men, women, and children alike. Their brutality stood out even among the authorities of the Eastern Front. Members of the brigade seemed to delight in chaos for its own sake. They would herd entire villages into a barn and burn them alive, not because it was more efficient, but because they enjoyed it more. Prisoners were regularly beaten, raped, tortured, or killed before ever seeing the labor camps they were designated for. Their atrocities were so extreme that even the German-appointed General Commissar of Minsk could no longer stand it. In late 1943, he wrote to the German High Command to complain about Dirlewanger and his men. Here, the name Dirlewanger plays a particularly significant role. The merciless war of annihilation he wages against an unarmed population deliberately ignores political necessities. His methods, worthy of the 30 Years' War, make a lie of the civil administration's assurances of wanting to work together with the Belarusian people. When women and children are shot en masse or burned alive, there is no longer a semblance of humane conduct of war. The number of villages burned during sweep operations exceeds that of those burned by the Bolsheviks. It is staggering that even the Nazis on the Eastern Front had to plead with high command to rein in this unit. However, these pleas were met with resistance. Himmler and Berger shielded Dirlewanger from investigation. Complaints about his sexual violence and sadism were suppressed, and the man was promoted instead. Far from being punished, the brigade was rewarded with new recruits. From 1942 to 1943, as manpower shortages grew severe, the Nazis began scraping the bottom of the barrel. Leveraging the unit's sinister reputation and Dirlewanger's direct and typically violent approach to discipline, the brigade became a dumping ground for the worst men Nazi Germany had to offer. By 1943, thieves, rapists, and murderers were being assigned to it in droves. They fit in perfectly and only added fuel to the fire of its brutal behavior. By 1944, the tide of war on the Eastern Front had turned decisively against the Nazis. The Dirlewanger Brigade, now swollen to 750 men, was moved westward in the face of the Soviet advance. In the summer of 1944, they were back in Poland. On August 1, with the Red Army drawing ever closer, resistance fighters led by the Polish Home Army launched a daring uprising in Warsaw against the Nazi occupation. 20,000 Poles took up arms in one of the largest rebellions against the Nazis. The German response was swift and brutal, with the Black Hunters as the tip of the spear. Fighting alongside them was the Russian collaborationist Kaminsky Brigade, a group with its own sordid history of atrocities. Beginning on August 4, the Dirlewanger Brigade began to systematically sweep through the capital. The Warsaw Uprising was the most intense and bloody experience the brigade had during the war. In a matter of days, they killed thousands of people within a few hundred square meters. During the Wola Massacre of August 5, they systematically eradicated every living human being in the district. Rebels and civilians, nurses and nuns, women and children. They stormed hospitals to execute the wounded in their beds, gunned down priests at the altars of their churches, and, after murdering their families, violated girls in their own homes. Even babies were not spared, with reports of brigade members using them for bayonet practice. On August 5 alone, the brigade slaughtered 12,500 people. By the time the uprising was crushed, they had killed over. The reports of the violence were so staggering that even Himmler, who at this point was personally engineering the extermination of Jews and other minorities, ordered SS units to monitor them. He feared not their inhumanity, but that their savagery might lead them to turn on fellow German soldiers. The Polish insurgents made them pay for it. The brigade entered Warsaw with just over 800 men, but thousands more would cycle through it during the 2-month effort to suppress the uprising. In all, the brigade reported over 2,500 casualties, 300% of their initial strength. However, no amount of brutality against civilians could stop the Soviet advance. After crushing the Warsaw Uprising, the Black Hunters were hastily reassigned to Slovakia to deal with another rebellion. On August 29, Slovak nationalists rebelled against the pro-Nazi government. The Dirlewanger Brigade arrived in mid-October and quickly set about dealing with the rebels, bringing their characteristic brutality to Slovakia. Notably, their emphasis on looting increased here. While always a feature of the brigade's behavior, it was unusually prominent in Slovakia, often seeming to be the group's primary objective. Perhaps they saw the writing on the wall. The Reich's days were numbered, and they were trying to grab whatever they could before the war ended. Another explanation is that the character of the unit had changed after the high casualties in Warsaw and the influx of new recruits. This unit, which began as a group of poachers, was now unrecognizable. Only a handful of its initial members remained, most of them now NCOs. The rest were a mix. Some were reassigned, SS, or police officers, sent there as punishment. About half were Wehrmacht soldiers, similarly placed in the unit as a disciplinary measure, and the remainder were prisoners and camp inmates, pressed into service as Germany ran out of manpower. Only a handful of men did not have a criminal record or disciplinary referral. By the end of October, the Slovak uprising was crushed, in no small part thanks to the brigade. In February 1945, as the defense of the German homeland began, the brigade received its final promotion, becoming a full SS Grenadier division. But this was a hollow and meaningless gesture. The German military was collapsing. In the final months of the war, the Dirlewanger Brigade slowly unraveled. Casualties and desertions whittled down its members. Dirlewanger himself was seriously wounded in combat in Brandenburg in late February and used his injury as an excuse to slip away from his unit. By the end of April, he was considered a deserter. The last of the Black Hunters made their final stand in Berlin, perhaps only a few dozen of them left. The last reports place them in Berlin in the final days of April, where it is assumed they were killed by the advancing Soviet forces. However, hundreds of the brigade's deserting veterans were still at large, not least of all Dirlewanger himself. Most would never be caught. It was impossible to track them all, and even harder to conclusively link any of them to specific crimes. It is thought that about 700 veterans of the Dirlewanger Brigade survived the war. It is a small consolation that Dirlewanger himself did not escape for long. On June 4, 1945, he was found in hiding by French forces. After confirming his true identity, they threw him into a jail cell in Altschausen. However, fate decided that his prison guards would be Polish. The Poles recognized the Butcher of Warsaw. On the night of June 6, they slipped into his cell, knowing no one would come to investigate the screams. Exactly what happened in that cell is unknown, but only the Polish soldiers came out. Although sensational rumors of his survival in South America or Africa swirled for years, most historians agree that Dirlewanger met his end in that cell, at the hands of his guards. Few men so richly deserved a miserable end, but his death meant the Allies never had the chance to interrogate him. What other crimes his men committed, and how they rationalized them if they ever tried, will forever remain unknown. We cannot simply dismiss Dirlewanger and his men as common sadists or psychopaths. They were, of course, but this was a fact that was celebrated and selected for by the Nazi leadership. Their depravity was a useful tool for the Nazis, one they continued to use despite, or perhaps because of its devastating consequences. They demonstrated how little compassion the Nazis had for anyone who did not fit their vision. Polish civilians, Jews, Slavic civilians. The Nazis needed inhuman people to dish out the inhuman cruelty their ideology demanded for these groups. Perhaps this is why so many of their fellow Nazis hated them. The Dirlewanger Brigade was the brutality of the Nazi regime laid bare, the ultimate proof that no amount of evil was off limits in achieving the Reich's goals, and a terrifying reminder that there is nothing so evil that some human beings will not do.